Yeah, this notion of getting people on your side or developing allies, of course, is essential for politicians. It's the one with the most voters, the one with the most compatriots supporting them, money-wise and otherwise, who gets to the top. Apart from Machiavelli, we've also been drawing on Sun Tzu, the famous art of war writer from China. And as in many cases, the Chinese got there before the West did. But he talked about building alliances. And indeed, we tried to invoke that in our measures. And it turns out to be a key for manipulation. The Machiavellian is well aware, and you can see that in some of the items on the Mach scale, of getting people on your side is essential to getting ahead. It might be the key element to it. Not standing up and leading, but getting people to be persuaded to your side.
Right, so the Machiavellian then, in that situation, the Machiavellian, I would say, is mimicking reciprocal sociability, right? Because if you and I form a relationship that's going to be stable over time, it's going to be something like, let's say, a 60% exchange. You'll contribute half, and I'll contribute half. But the reason I represented that as 60% or maybe 75% is because if you and I engage in reciprocal, honest trading, the sum total of our activity will exceed the sum of our individual activities, right? We can do more together than we could do apart. And so there's all sorts of sense to be made for the establishment of these honest, durable, and reciprocal relationships. But what that also means is that if most people establish those, then people who only act as if they're establishing them can capitalize on that. Just like the narcissists and the psychopaths, with their false confidence, can mimic competence and fool. Well, there's good literature evidence, for example, that the Dark Tetrad types, broadly speaking, are particularly good if they're male at fooling young women. You know, as women get older, they get better at separating out the narcissists from the competent men. But initially, because the narcissists have this confidence that is a marker of competence, even though not an invariable marker, they can easily be fooled. And so that opens up the landscape of cooperators to exploitation by a small minority of predators and parasites. So what else have you found out on the social media front? And where do you think the interesting research is? Where's the interesting research going on in that area? And do you have any sense of what sort of constraints need to be put in place in online forums to keep the psychopaths under control? Like, I've come out recently against anonymity because my sense, I've read tens of thousands of online comments. My sense is that a radical proportion of anonymous posters have these Dark Tetrad traits. And I know there's a research literature that actually indicates that as well. And so I've been attacked for that because people think that, their right to free speech also involves this right to anonymous posting. And I can understand that argument, but the problem is it does seem to me to open up the landscape to the predatory parasite types, and that's a real problem. So have you thought about, what have you seen that you regard as a credible deterrence, if any, on the virtual side to the dominance and proliferation of Dark Tetrad behavior?
No solutions have come to mind. It seems out of control when you go to a website and ask for comments, which is really trying to get feedback to whatever is on your site. It seems, I think somebody calculated, it takes about 10 comments before someone says, "Oh yeah, f*** you."
Yeah, well, so you're talking about this proclivity of open online discourse to turn into a kind of swarm, and characterized by the presence of, well, I really do think it heats up the whole political environment, because, you know, you alluded to earlier the fact that there's lots of things people won't say in person, partly for legal reasons, but also partly for physical reasons. And both the legal and the physical constraints are removed in the virtualized world. And that does seem to produce an unbelievable flowering of pathological commentary. And then I really do believe that that makes everyone think the world and the people in it are a lot worse than they really are. Because it magnifies the effect of this tiny minority, especially the sadists, you know. It's been so interesting to me to watch your concept of Dark Triad expand to take into account that positive delight in suffering, because I don't think you can really understand like radical evil by merely making reference to narcissism and instrumental Machiavellianism and even psychopathy. You need pleasure in suffering to really add that last, you know, nail into the coffin, so to speak.
Yeah, one interesting goal we had was to try to find the female sadists on all four of these components. We've males score higher, and even in sadism, we figured there's the mean girls phenomenon. We all have this sense that women can be nasty in different ways, perhaps. And so we tried to develop items, especially with my colleague Erin Buckles at the University of Winnipeg. She's working on this. And so is Tracy Vaillancourt at Ottawa U. They are looking at relational aggression. So women may use different ways, not physical or less physical, and gossiping, for example, spreading lies. There are a few others that exploit the verbal abilities of women and allow them to be nasty to people that they think deserve it. And so those people are working actively on trying to get a measure of sadism that would apply to women even more than to men, because
I wonder if that would involve pleasure in exclusion. You know, I mean, it's definitely the case that, well, if you use time out on a child, one of the reasons it works is because it's technically a punishment. It produces something akin to pain, but the pain is essentially social. It's involuntary social isolation. And so if you exclude someone, which is what the mean girl types do, right? That's their primary, this reputation destruction and exclusion seems to be their particular bailiwick. You see that with female antisocial behavior. And there is a pain associated with that, which is the pain of social rejection. And it's not trivial. Like, it's very, very hard on people. And so you could imagine that positive delight in observing the fruits of social exclusion might be a canonical characteristic of female sadism.
Yeah, that's a good idea to focus on that, because we know that male friendships are more based on common interests. Female friendships are more of a bonding, an emotional bonding, and therefore the exclusion tactic would be much more devastating for women. Good idea.
Yeah. Well, so I studied the development of male and female antisocial behavior for a long time, you know, and it's pretty obvious that female antisocial types, by and large, are less sort of impulsively criminal than males are, which is why there aren't very many females in jail. But that ability to denigrate and to gossip and to destroy reputation is much more characteristic of the female antisocial types, and they can be really, really good at it. And the frightening thing about that, too, to some degree, is that, you know, male aggression of the physical sort doesn't scale worth a damn on social media, because you can't use physical aggression on social media. But the female pattern of antisocial behavior, which is reputation destruction and social exclusion, man, that scales like a charm on social media, especially because of what you described as the negative halo effect. You know, and I really noticed this. I should be very resistant to that negative halo effect when I pick out my guests for my podcast, because I have had a lot of guests on my podcast, and now and then I talk to people who've been mobbed, excluded, or had their reputation damaged for one reason or another. You know, and even when I know perfectly well that there's a high probability that they've been lied about and that they've been the target of this kind of malicious gossip, there's still a strong proclivity in me that I have to fight to overcome, not to assume something like, well, where there's smoke, there's fire. You know, and you don't have to sully someone's reputation much before you raise the cost that other people need to bear to interact with them, right? I mean, we all have, in principle, thousands of people we could interact with. And so we're always looking for a reason, in some sense, not to interact with people. And if a terrible rumor has spread about someone, well, the cost to me to avoiding that person can be very, very low. But the cost to that person, if everyone avoids them, is unbelievably high.
Yeah, most people care about how a person treats them specifically, and they can overlook rumors often because the other person has treated them personally well. So that's a dynamic that works in the other direction to cut down on the negative effect of rumors and gossip, that sort of thing.
Right, assuming that you actually have that personal relationship. You know, one of the things I've also seen as a consequence of virtualization, you know, if I'm working with people virtually, and so we haven't established that kind of personal relationship, if any issue comes up that's negative, it seems to have a larger effect than it would if we had established a long-term, more personal face-to-face interaction. So as long as things are going smoothly, the virtual interaction seems to go well, but it's really easy for anything negative to be magnified. And I think it's partly because you don't have that buffer that you just described, which is maybe something like the evidence of repeated interactions face-to-face, evidence of repeated acts of kindness and so forth, so that you have that as a data body to offset the negative event against.
Yeah, right on all of those points. I did want to talk a little bit about your work on the Big Five with respect to the challenges to the Big Five as well as the challenges to my work kind of dovetail in an interesting way. And that is, although the Big Five has become the consensus for the broad personality traits, so Big Fivers mostly assume that they've covered it all because they're working at such a high level. And people like me who are working from time to time on individual traits, that would be farther down the hierarchy of the personality space. Now, it turns out that you can add at least one other dimension to the Big Five, and that's been contributed by Ashton and Lee, two Canadian researchers who have, to some extent, eaten away at the popularity of the Big Five by talking about the Big Six, or the hexaco.
Right.
And what they've added is a dimension called the honesty, humility, which was a poor choice, I thought. But it turns out that extra dimension they added subsumes all of the dark traits that I've been working on.
Oh, I didn't know that. I wanted to ask you that. Oh, when was that discovered?
That has been coming to light over the last 5 years. And so I've certainly turned to favoring the Big Six instead of the Big Five in some of my recent work, in terms of, we know that personality space is rather amorphous, and you can rotate dimensions in multiple ways to suit your fancy. But this one suits me because it shows where the dark traits fall with respect to a comprehensive personality space. They all fall together under this one dimension, honesty, humility. And so I really appreciated the Ashton and Lee for...
Now, do you think that's because Ashton and Lee, is it because they included, in some sense, some of the originally excluded words from their statistical samples of adjectives, the ones that are more evaluative? Because, I mean, your phrases or sentences are really quite evaluative on the moral dimension, and so they wouldn't have been considered in the initial Big Five corpus. And then honesty, humility seems to be kind of in the middle of that, right? Because it's obviously better morally to be honest and humble than to be dishonest and arrogant. And so you're sneaking there or stepping into the domain of ethical categorization. But I wanted to ask you, actually, like if you throw your sentences into a sentence level Big Five, like the ocean model, I think what you just said is that the individual sentences will line up, the Dark Triad or Dark Tetrad sentences will line up on a dimension that's the opposite side of honesty, humility. Do they break out across other factors as well? Or like how much does honesty, humility subsume the Dark Triad on the negative side?
Well, it's pretty much the whole thing is there under honesty, humility. They do have a couple of other negative traits in there. So there's a slightly broader, which suggests maybe we could add a couple of other negative traits to our pantheon of aversive personalities. That's one direction to look in anyway. It's interesting what you say about pulling out the negative traits, which Cattell did many years ago, and Tellegen and a few others have pursued that. And indeed, I think that's there if one looks hard enough at the work of earlier personality researchers. The Big Seven was available in the 70s, and one of those looked like a dark personality factor. So that would make an interesting paper to track that issue. Interesting you put that together.
Has anybody done a large-scale compilation of the Dark Tetrad items with the hexacle model, like on thousands and thousands of people? Have you done that yet?
Others have done that, yeah. Yeah, it's there. The Germans have always been known as good psychometricians, and they've shown in a number of large-scale studies that both in German and in English, they can work as well in English, have show that clear pattern.
Oh yeah, okay, well that's really worthwhile knowing. So what forms of behavior do you think are most powerfully predicted by the Dark Tetrad questionnaires? Like the sorts of things that people might encounter in their day-to-day life, if we can bring this to life for people. We're focusing on a set of personality attributes. What are you likely to experience if you encounter someone who is characterized by a plethora of these characteristics?
Well, that's kind of a summary of our goals in my laboratory, and that is we want to develop practical measurement instruments. One can find a lot of interesting things in Freud's Thanatos and Jung's shadow, but you're not going to be able to ask people about those in a job interview. So what we want are measures that can be applied to ordinary people, whether they're job selection, you want certain kinds of people, and sometimes you want a little bit of the dark side, sometimes not. Even in these romantic websites where you're pairing up people, you want to know a little bit about the potential partners. The dark side is starting to prove useful there. So practical measures that you can present to large groups or diagnose people is is what we've been aiming for. And so the psychometrics have been the most important thing, getting it right.
So we tried in California on that front. This might be something you'd be interested in methodologically. So I put together a behavioral predictive battery that was very short cognitive analysis, which is based